Let me go to the issue of China as well for both of you. Um, I've talked a lot about how I think this period right now is analogous to kind of the 1946-47 period, where our country, is awakened to a new challenge, like we did after World War II with the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and George Kennan and others laying out a long-term bipartisan strategy of containment. And I think we're at a similar position here. I'm always amazed how quickly things have changed, in my view, in a positive bipartisan way. When I got to the Senate 6 years ago, I used to give a pretty regular speech about China and the challenges, and I would say, nobody's talking about China. We're in the U.S. Senate. Nobody's even talking about it. Well, you obviously can't give that speech anymore. Everybody's talking about it. That's good. And to be honest, the national security strategy, national defense strategy, which you had a lot to do with, General McMaster, was a huge reason for that. And that's very bipartisan, the recognition of great power competition. But what do we need to do next? What do we need to do next? We need to put meat on the bones, from my view, of a strategy that you started. And I've been reaching out to the Biden administration saying, look, this needs to be long-term, needs to be bipartisan. This committee can help. But do both of you have ideas and suggestions on kind of the next step? The awakening has occurred, thanks to you and others. But what kind of details for a long-term bipartisan strategy do we need to address this issue, which what I've been saying is the next issue for our country for the next 50 to 100 years?
Right.
What do we need to do, General?
Well, Senator, what we recognize that we needed to translate this recognition of the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and its policies into real action. And there we did develop 7 kind of components to that strategy that you saw declassified, the Indo-Pacific strategy. I believe these are fundamentally sound. They all need to be improved on in terms of how they're conceptualized and how they're implemented. But for example, one of those I think is probably of paramount importance, which is how to counter Chinese economic aggression. Because I think we understand what we have to do. I know we have to commit the resources and do it from a military and a deterrence perspective. But this sustained effort by the Chinese under Made in China 2025 and under the overarching concept of military-civil fusion aims to give the People's Liberation Army a differential advantage in future war, and to do so mainly by vast state resources committed, but also by sustained industrial espionage against us and other developed economies and like-minded liberal democracies. So I think the most important thing is really, first of all, let's defend ourselves. Let's make sure that the MSS, the Ministry for State Security, and the People's Liberation Army have not infiltrated our research activities, which they did with almost impunity. I mean, it's gut-wrenching to see how much has been stolen right out from under our noses, and much of that research funded by the Congress. Then, but we have to go beyond defense. We need investments in our own research and development programs, and a greater partnership with the private sector, and a recognition across our entrepreneurial class that this is a real competition. I think the financial dimension of this is something worth a great deal of scrutiny. We are, in large measure, underwriting our own demise by investments in Chinese companies and in China, which allow them to commit those resources to gaining a differential military advantage over us, and then to gain a predominant advantage in the emerging data-driven global economy. And I'll ask Thomas to comment on this as well.
If you don't mind, before my time runs out, I want to throw out another idea, both of you to comment on. Dr. Wright, I'd like for you to comment on my first question. And the second one, I couldn't agree more with Senator King on allies. We have to look at comparative advantages. That's a huge one. Let me give you another one that I think is actually important. Senator King mentioned that China's the largest producer of renewables. They're also by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. The United States, from 2005 to 2017, we reduced greenhouse gas emissions by almost 15%. No major country in the world is even close to how well we're doing on this. Meanwhile, China pollutes they're double the amount of emissions we have. The comparative advantage I'm talking about is the United States is now the world's energy superpower once again. Prior to the pandemic, largest producer of oil, natural gas, and renewables in the world. Is that a comparative advantage in the competition with China we need to accelerate? Or unfortunately, with the Biden administration, they're focused on actually crushing this advantage unilaterally. I guarantee you the Chinese are loving that policy from this new administration. So if you'll both comment on these issues very quickly, I appreciate it.
Senator, if I could address maybe the climate change part of it and try to
And
merge
energy
it.
superpower.
Yeah, and maybe merge it into an answer to your first question too. I think General McMaster and I disagree on the Paris Agreement, but I think one element of climate policy that's really important to look at in the context of great power competition is that climate policy will itself become a zone of competition, right? And particularly in new clean technology and an access to precious resources. I document some of these in the written sort of statement, but on magnets, batteries, high performance ceramics, LEDs and the like.
Clean burning natural gas from America?
There will be a competition between democratic countries and China. So I think it's important to look at that part of it as well. And then in answer to your first question, I think one area where the Congress could really help, I think, in bringing forward the strategy of great power competition is understanding, as we rebuild sort of the U.S. economy after the pandemic, how to make investments that make the United States more strategically competitive. And I think there is common ground across the aisle on that issue.
Right. Hey, Senator, I think I would just offer that the way you framed it, I think, is exactly the right way to look at it. I think what happens is we only look at one dimension of interconnected problems, and then we suboptimize in a way that cuts against really, our what should be our advantages, as well as our ability to help solve that interconnected problem set. And what you're talking about is really the connection between energy security, economic growth to a certain extent, obviously, and then also the very real problems of climate change and global warming. And I think if we disconnect those, we miss opportunities, as you're mentioning. I should mention that I advise a company that is engaged now in exporting LNG, right? And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm a true believer in it. It was that conversion that reduced carbon emissions to a very significant level here in the United States. And this is, I think, a clear bridging capability. But let me also say, though, that renewables now are more affordable. The point that I was making was not that we should be out of Paris. It's that Paris can't give us a false sense of security, right? We need to do more than what's in Paris. And the only way to do it is with solutions that are economically viable in developing economies, such that the Chinese will want to do it, the Indians will want to do it. So that's really, I think, the way ahead is to look at the interconnected problem set and work on it holistically, because this also involves food and water security as well. But I think that's the right frame to have.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan.